Before we begin, a couple of quick notes. This episode is much longer than usual. To keep it manageable, I have divided it into chapters, roughly 20 minutes long. You'll find time codes in the episode description, or every time you hear this noise, that means it's a good place to take a rest. Additionally, the Battle of Kadesh comes to us from several distinct sources. In order to minimize interruptions, I discuss these at the end. With that out of the way, please enjoy the Battle of Kadesh. In late June of 1287 BCE, approximately, a day dawned in Egypt and the Near East that would prove to be one of the more famous in history. It probably began like any other. As the night receded and the pale light of dawn appeared in the sky, Egypt's temples would have slowly returned to life. Awakening from the death of night, clergy and acolytes began to prepare for a new day. In the far south, at the city of Waset, or Luxor, priests entered the magnificent house of Amun, which today we know as Karnak. Passing the great pylons, the hypostyle hall, obelisks, and courtyards, the worshippers approached the inner sanctum of the god. Their leader was named Neb-Wenenef, the first priest of Amun. He held his position by the grace of the king, who had promoted him just 4 years earlier. Today, Pharaoh himself was absent from the Nile Valley, and as his representative, Neb-Wenenef greeted the god Amun and made offerings for the king's well-being. A few hundred kilometers downriver, another priest performed similar duties in the city of Ptah, the house of Ptah's spirit, what we call Memphis. His name was Hui, and he was the senior priest for Ptah, the master artisan. Hui probably approached the golden shrine, drew back the door bolts, and then opened the god's house of wood and gold. Within, the face of Ptah emerged from the shadows. Impassive, thoughtful, the god of the spoken word awaited his daily offerings. To the east and downriver again, the temple of Ra at Iunu, or Heliopolis, was more than busy in the pre-dawn hours. Here, priests, priestesses, and temple staff moved about in open-air courtyards, ready to welcome the sun. At the heart of this sanctuary, a man named Bak may have led the proceedings. Bak was the chief of seers, the title for the high priest of Ra. His offerings were rich. There were loaves of bread, sticky cakes, piles of vegetables, flowers, and cuts of top-quality beef and poultry, all intended for the god's consumption. Candles and incense burners lifted their heat, light, and scent towards the sky. The worshippers, including Bak, looked eastward toward the coming sunrise and the return of the solar creator. Finally, in the farthest north, the temple of Sutekh at Hutwaret, or Avaris, bustled with duties for their god. A priest, whose name is now lost, readied his offerings upon an altar. It was relatively new, made of polished granite, and inscribed with the cartouches of Men Ma'at Ra, that is, the king Seti I, now deceased, the father of the current pharaoh. Seti had given Sutekh a new offering table, which survives to this day. As the anonymous priest lit his candles, incense, and prepared his offerings, he might recite the names of that deceased ruler, and he too might turn eastward toward the coming sunrise. For by night, Sutekh, the great of strength, rode upon the ship of Ra, protecting the solar deity from demons and monsters. The priests of Sutekh raised their offerings to satisfy their great lord, and like their comrades, they looked to the east. While the priests made their offerings to the great gods, the sun's first light crept over the eastern horizon. 700 kilometers east and north of Egypt, by the land routes, that light also fell upon foreign lands. And in a distant valley, called the Valley of the Conifers, the brilliance of Ra alighted upon a camp. An Egyptian army was on the march. At its head, the pharaoh himself had taken the field. The victorious bull, beloved of Ma'at, the protector of Egypt, who subdues all foreign lands, the rich in years, the great of victories, the son of Ra, king of the two lands. His name was Wasmuria Satepnaria, Ramesses Mai Amana. Today, we know him as Ramesses II. The king of Egypt arose with the coming of the dawn. A new day had arrived, a day for battle. In June of 1287 BCE, Ramesses arrived at a hill south of Kadesh. The king had been on the march for 30 days, exactly, and on this, the 31st, Ramesses and part of his army were encamped. He marked this day in his recollections of the campaign. Quote, "Now, his person was in Jahi, or Syria, on his second campaign of victory. A happy awakening occurred in life, prosperity, and health in his person's tent on the ridge south of Kadesh. At the time of dawn, his person appeared like Ra when he shines, and the king took up the armor of his father Montu." End quote. Ramesses and his army had set up their camp in what is now the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon. They rested atop a ridge or foothill, which Ramesses creatively called Cheset Resit Net Kadesh, the mountain south of Kadesh. This was probably a mound called the Kamwat el Harmel. It is about 20 kilometers or 13 miles south of Kadesh itself. The pharaoh had arrived at his strategic goal. Now, the final stretch began. Ramesses awoke, perhaps with the dawn, and emerged from his tent. Around him, the royal bodyguard stood to attention. The generals and courtiers awaited his pleasure, and beyond that, the soldiers of Pharaoh were packing up the camp. The king had arrived near Kadesh with 5,000 troops, give or take. This was the Mesha en Imen, or the Division of Amun, one of 4 army battalions who marched along the Bekaa Valley. The others, named for Ra, Ptah, and Sutek, marched behind Amun, strung out along the road. In total, they numbered 20,000 men, approximately. A massive force for a royal campaign. It would take time for each division to arrive. Ramesses and Amun were at the front, but according to his own records, the battalions marched in a staggered fashion. Behind Amun, the division of Ra was approximately 10 kilometers, or 6.5 miles southward. Then, an equal distance behind that, came Ptah, and finally Sutek brought up the rear. The plan, clearly, was to spread the army out while marching. Then, having arrived at Kadesh, they could concentrate their forces and begin the siege. In hindsight, this may seem rather foolhardy. The divided approach meant that Ramesses was not moving with 20,000 men, all ready to fight. Instead, the Egyptians were moving as 4 separate armies strung out along the road. If an enemy should attack any one of those divisions, they would need to fight alone for at least several hours. Messengers would have to hurry along the line, then a relief force would need to pick up the pace, or turn around and come back in order to assist. Hypothetically, a strong enough attack might scatter, even destroy, an army regiment before their comrades knew what was happening. On the other hand, this staggered approach had its benefits. If an enemy tried to flank the Egyptian army, they would need to cover much more territory. Additionally, it paid dividends in terms of supply and logistics. 20,000 men camping at a single location would represent a major drain on the local farmers and villagers. By spreading the troops out, the Egyptians could supply each division separately. A much simpler task. Finally, the 4 armies were not helpless. Each one included infantry, archers, and chariots. Basically a combined arms force moving independently. So if necessary, these divisions might fight on their own as a kind of independent army. Then, once messengers reached their comrades, they could potentially hurry to the battle site and attack the enemy's flank, catching them off guard and maybe eradicating them. So on the ridge south of Kadesh, Ramesses encamped with the 5,000 men and chariots of the Amun division. Plus, he had his bodyguards and entourage, but we don't know how many people they were. As the force moved north, approaching the city, the other divisions would slowly trickle in. Eventually, after a day or two, they would all gather at the target, ready to attack. Finally, there was a 5th division. While marching through Canaan, Ramesses had selected a battalion of his troops, whom he called the Sekhet Pay, or First Battle Line. Those troops had not marched with Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Sutek. Instead, they had gone west along the Mediterranean coast to a land called Amru, which is part of modern Lebanon and Syria. The goal, presumably, was to gather reinforcements from local vassals, or simply to ensure that no unexpected enemies appeared on Ramesses' flank. The march of the Sekhet Pay was carefully planned, and they now moved on a strict timetable. If they did their job, and there were no problems, the 5th Division should arrive at Kadesh within the next day or two, ready to supplement the others. So 4 divisions marching in a line, staggered over many miles. A 5th Division moving to the west, guarding the flank and perhaps bringing reinforcements. A simple plan on papyrus, although difficult to execute in a timely manner. One could only hope that it went smoothly, that the army of Pharaoh would gather in full force at the proper place and time. Many things were in the hands of the gods. Around 6:30 a.m., give or take, soldiers lifted their burdens upon their shoulders. Porters loaded up the donkeys and oxen. Trumpeters blared the summons, and amid the ranks, officers bellowed the call to march. One could almost imagine them. Arise, arise, warriors of Ramesses. Spears will be shaken, shields will be battered. It is a sword day, a red day, now that Ra is rising. That's not hyperbole. In the ancient Egyptian sense, red, or desher, was the color of fury, wrath, and forces beyond control or order. It was also the color of fire, blood, and the burning brilliance of the sun. The attack on Kadesh, now so close, would certainly involve all of those things. For Ramesses, though, every day was technically a red day. Studies of the king's mummy have shown that Ramesses himself had reddish hair. That tracks with what we know of his family lineage. Based on their monuments, the Ramessids appear to be northern Egyptians, an area that, historically, was richly populated with people of different cultures. In cities like Hutwaret, Avaris, you would probably find residents of Egyptian, Libyan, Canaanite, and Syrian descent. Fittingly, that dovetails further with the red of the king's hair and the day to come. For last but not least, red was the color of Sutek, a patron deity of Ramesses' family and namesake of an army battalion, now awaking in their camp about 30 kilometers south. The Sutek division would join Ramesses in a day and a half, but in one sense, Sutek himself was already with the king, coloring his hair and looking ahead to the day of heat and blood. The god must have been salivating at the thought of the violence to come. Ramesses, his entourage, his bodyguards, and the army division of Amun struck their camp and made their way down out of the valley. Ahead, the city of Kadesh perched atop a hill in the midst of a floodplain divided by a river. This was the Orontes River, or Arantu in Egyptian, which flowed past the city and further north into Syria. Ramesses' army would need to cross Orontes to make their final approach. The king described this as, quote, "Behold, his person was in the valley of the conifer trees. He travelled on northward. Then, when he had reached the ridge of Kadesh, his person went straight on, like his father Montu, the lord of Waset, and he crossed the ford of the Orontes River with the army division of Amun, who gives victory to the pharaoh. Thus his person arrived at the town of Kadesh." End quote. The crossing of Orontes at a river ford passed without incident. For the Egyptian soldiers, it may have seemed both comfortingly familiar and quite strange. On the one hand, Orontes was narrower and shallower than the Nile, and the idea of just walking across it might have seemed unusual. But the Orontes also flowed south to north and supported a wide, rich floodplain, so the landscape was not too alien, all things considered. At this particular area, the Orontes itself actually forms from two rivers, and the city of Kadesh occupies a hill where those two branches meet. Ramesses shows the town in his art on the walls of temples. Kadesh appears like an island rising amid the waterways. It has high walls, gates, and towers overlooking the river and floodplain. Today, the archaeological site of Kadesh is well known. It is called the Tel Nebi Mend. The city remains a focal point of the surrounding landscape. A small town spreads over the hill of Kadesh and the lower areas, but for the most part, the Orontes and its branch continue to shape a flat and fertile landscape. Modern Kadesh is surrounded by farmland. I imagine if you visited, it wouldn't require too much imagination to conjure the ancient landscape. Splashing through the water, Ramesses' foot soldiers emerged onto the northern bank. Although wet and bedraggled, they were now on the final stretch of their march. Ahead, the city was just 11 kilometers, or 6 miles to the north. Based on the distances from the hill south of Kadesh to this part of the river, it was probably 10 a.m. Ramesses and the Amun division would not launch their attack immediately. Instead, they were going to turn west of the city itself and establish a camp just west of the river. From a fortified position, Ramesses could await his other divisions, and he could dispatch scouts or spies into the surrounding area. Kadesh itself was no problem. The Egyptians had taken the city before, they would do it again. But what of the enemy? The rulers of Kadesh, or Weru Chesiu, wretched great ones, gave their loyalty to the king of Hatti. Muwatalli II, lord of the Hittites, counted Kadesh among his many vassals. Muwatalli was in Syria. Egyptian spies had probably reported that much. But where was he exactly, and when would he march on Kadesh? That remained unclear. That Muwatalli would march was probably beyond doubt. As Ramesses himself tells it, he fully expected to meet the Hittites in this region. It might take time, but it would happen. Whether they came to relieve Kadesh directly, or whether they wanted Ramesses to carry on north, deeper into Syria, that currently remained unknown. For now, the best the Egyptians could do was set up a camp, send out their scouts, and await the rest of the army. The division of Amun and Ramesses himself crossed the Orontes River and turned west. Soon, the army approached a small village called Shabtuna. We don't know where this was exactly, but it was probably about 5.5 kilometers or 4 miles from the river crossing. The king probably reached Shabtuna around 11:30 in the morning. At this moment, something interesting happened. Scouting the countryside, Ramesses' troops came upon some locals. 2 nomads, whom the Egyptians called Shasu, or Bedouin, now enter our story. We don't know their names, just that Pharaoh's soldiers brought them to see the king. Presumably there was an interpreter able to translate from Canaanite, and the Shasu spoke freely to the Egyptians. The encounter went as follows, quote, "The Lord, Ramesses, proceeded north and reached the area south of the town Shabtuna. There came 2 Shasu to say to his person, the king, 'Our brothers and chiefs are united with the wretched one of Hatti. But they have sent us to Ramesses to say that we, the Shasu people, shall become servants of Pharaoh, life, prosperity, health, and we will separate ourselves from the Great One of Hatti." End quote. Ah, interesting. Apparently there was discontent in the ranks of Muwatalli's army. That was reasonably common. Written records from Syria and Canaan frequently mention rebellions, discontent, and perpetual squabbles between the vassals and their overlords. Loyalties shifted quickly, depending on who the greater power was at any given moment. The Egyptians understood this dynamic well. The city of Kadesh itself had submitted to their authority on numerous occasions, only to turn their coats and go with Hatti as soon as convenient. Now, there was a new opportunity for such diplomatic wrangling. If the Shasu were willing to rebel, that might upset the Hittite military plans. Ramesses considered this offer, and he replied to the Shasu, quote, "Then his person said to them, 'Where are they, your brothers, who sent you to speak with me?' The Shasu replied to his person, saying, 'They are where the wretched one of Hatti is, for he is in the land of Aleppo, to the north of Tunip. The Hittite feared the king of Egypt too much to come south when he heard that Pharaoh was coming north.'" End quote. A breakthrough. The diplomatic and strategic situation had been shadowy so far, but now Ramesses could confirm what he might have expected. The Hittites were in Syria. Muwatalli had come forth from his northern capital, but they weren't at Kadesh just yet. Instead, the Hittites had gathered at the ancient city of Halab, modern Aleppo. That was approximately 190 kilometers north of Kadesh, or 119 miles as the falcon flies. It would take an army at least 10 days to cover that distance. Thus, assuming the Hittites had not already moved, Ramesses was well ahead of his enemy. Again, it was likely they would come south, but the Egyptians now had time to do two things. They could concentrate their forces, bringing the 4 divisions and the Sekhet Pay together, and they could begin to invest or besiege Kadesh itself. The plan had worked. Ramesses had got the drop on his foe. Having interrogated the Shasu, the pharaoh carried on. He and the Amun division resumed their northward march, heading west of the Orontes. There they would make their camp. Quote, "Thus, his person, the king, travelled northward, arriving at the northwest of Kadesh. The camp of his person's army was pitched there, and he sat upon the throne of Electrum to the north of Kadesh, on the west side of the Orontes." End quote. The journey was done, and what a march it had been. For 31 days, the Egyptian army had been on the road. Now, at last, and probably a bit footsore, they were here. It was approximately 1:30 by the time Ramesses sat on his golden throne. In the 7 hours since they had departed their camp, he and the division of Amun had effectively done a full day's march. Now it was time to set up fortifications, erect a fence or barrier, post the guards, send out the scouts, and then, hopefully, get some rest. Everyone could relax. Things were going to plan. On the day of arriving at Kadesh, in the early afternoon, the Egyptian army established their camp. 5,000 troops, the division of Amun, began erecting a fence surrounding an enclosed area. They may have reinforced that fence with shields. In the art that Ramesses commissioned, we see the camp as a horizontal rectangle, with the distinctive Egyptian shields around the perimeter. It's unclear if that is literal, that they actually fortified with infantry equipment, or if it's metaphorical, conveying the idea of a military encampment as a kind of grandiose hieroglyph. Take it either way. At the heart of the camp, in the art and reality, was Ramesses' own tent. It was probably surrounded by another fence or low wall, guarded by the king's personal soldiers. The tent itself appears as a kind of pavilion, and based on surviving pieces from tombs, we can guess that it was made of leather in a sort of green and red patchwork. The upper edges would have decorations of plants, wild animals, or symbols of the sun god Ra. Within, Ramesses took up his throne atop a wooden podium. Around the king, high-ranking courtiers and army officials gathered to report their news and discuss the next steps. It is extremely likely that the royal entourage also included a woman and 2 young boys. From the hieroglyph captions in Ramesses' art, we know that he brought at least 2 of his sons on campaign. One of them was named Pa-Ra-Her-Wenemef, or the sun god is upon his right arm. The other is unknown, the name is lost, but it might have been the eldest son, Amun-Her-Kopeshef, Amun is upon his sword, or the second son, Ramesses Jr. The woman, I think, was probably Toya, the king's mother, who was the preeminent lady in the early part of the reign. One of Toya's titles was Mut Necher, or Mother of the God, and that title appears in the inscriptions for Kadesh. We don't have an image of the Queen Mother herself, but it's a reasonable bet she was in the tent. As Ramesses took up his throne west of Kadesh, an army was moving to the south. The division of Ra had now reached the end of the Bekaa Valley, and they were starting to cross the Orontes River. The foot soldiers lifted their packs, the chariots were loaded up on donkeyback, and messengers on horseback trotted across. Again, this division probably numbered some 5,000 men. It would take time to ford the river, reassemble the ranks, and then set off on the new march. Meanwhile, scouts ranged the hinterland, and at some point, around 1:30 p.m. or so, Egyptian warriors stumbled upon 2 men hiding in the scrub. They were dressed strangely, in robes that stretched from shoulder to ankle, and they spoke an unfamiliar language. If they were armed, we do not know, but the Egyptian scouts took them prisoner, hauled them onto a horse or chariot, and headed off for the royal camp. In his tent, Ramesses and his council discussed the issues of the day, until they were disturbed by the arrival of the scout. The warriors of Egypt brought in their 2 foreign prisoners and threw them to the ground before the pharaoh. An interpreter stepped forward, speaking to these unknowns and then reporting to the king. The news was disconcerting. These prisoners were Hittites. Ramesses described their arrival and his interrogation of the captives. Quote, "Then came a scout who was in his person's service, bringing in 2 scouts of the fallen one of Hatti. They were ushered into the royal presence. Then his person said to them, 'What are you?' They replied, 'We belong to the great one of Hatti. It is he who sent us, to see where the king of Egypt is.' The king said to the Hittites, 'Where is he, the wretched one of Hatti? I have heard that he is in the land of Aleppo, to the north of Tunip.' But they, the scouts, said to his person, 'Behold, the great one of Hatti has come, along with the many foreign lands that accompany him, whom he has brought as allies. They are provided with their foot soldiers and chariots, with their fighting weapons. They are more numerous than the sands of the beach. Behold, they stand equipped, ready to fight, behind old Kadesh.'" End quote. The news must have arrived like a thunderclap. The captive Hittites were scouts of the great king Muwatalli, who was not at Aleppo, a safe distance away. He was here with his army near Kadesh. The enemy had achieved a deception. An attack was at hand.
"It's a trap."
In a fury, Ramesses ordered his guards to beat the 2 Hittite spies. We see it in the art. On all of the major temples, we find the king enthroned, but below him, the 2 Hittites kneel to the ground, surrounded by soldiers. The Egyptians wield clubs, striking them mercilessly. A bit harsh in the circumstances, the scouts were just doing their job, but that is how Ramesses chose to depict the situation. Carved in stone, the Hittites endure their punishment for eternity. Ouch. Punish the spies though they might, the court must have realized they were in danger. The Egyptian army was vulnerable as each division was strung out along the road, and they would take time to regroup. Quote, "Now, his person was all alone, with just his followers. The division of Amun was behind him, but the division of Ra was still crossing the river ford in the area south of Shabtuna, at a distance of 1 iter, or river length, from where his person was. The division of Ptah was south of the town of Arnam. The division of Sutek was still marching along the road. The Sekhet Pay, the first battle line, were on the bank in the land of Amaru." End quote. So, at best, Ramesses had some 5,000 ordinary troops, the division of Amun, and his royal bodyguard for protection. A sizable force, to be sure, but insufficient to face a full Hittite army. The king was isolated and vulnerable. He needed help, and he needed it now. Ramesses acted quickly, ordering messengers to go forth. They would race south to each of the army divisions and command them to hurry. "Come now, your pharaoh needs you." Alas, this would take time. From Ramesses' own description, the Ra division was 1 iter, or river length, which is about 10.5 kilometers or 6.5 miles. They would take a couple of hours to arrive, at least. Then, Ptah division was 21 kilometers or 13 miles from the king, a full day's march at normal pace. And Sutek, well, we don't know where they were exactly, but if the army divisions were marching at roughly equal distances, then the last was probably 32 kilometers or 19 miles away. They wouldn't arrive until tomorrow afternoon, at best. Add to that the time required for messengers to reach them, and you can see the problem. The Egyptian army was divided and would not concentrate for many hours yet. Meanwhile, the Hittites were here. They knew Ramesses had arrived, and there was every chance they were already moving to attack. About 10 kilometers to the south, 6.5 miles, the division of Ra emerged from the waters of Orontes, splashing across the ford, then drying themselves off on the riverbank. They soon set off north along the road. We don't know much about Egyptian marching order, but in the circumstances, they were probably somewhat disorganized. Carrying the goods, chariots, animals, and people across the river would have been quite disruptive. So as they marched, the division probably started to stretch out along the road. There may have been horsemen or charioteers out on the wings, shielding the main force and giving the infantry time to respond. But after a month-long march, and having just forded a river, the division of Ra was probably tired and slightly disorderly. Certainly not in prime fighting condition. As they carried on northward, soldiers on the eastern flank started to point to their right. A haze, like a cloud of dust, had appeared on the horizon. What was that? The Orontes River flowed that way, leading away from the ford they had just crossed, and the city of Kadesh was far to the north. What was kicking up all of that dust? Then, a shrill echo on the breeze, a rumble vibrating underfoot. To the east, a dark mass appeared through the haze. Sunlight glinted off bare metal. Dust arose from wheels. Slowly, the Egyptian soldiers understood what they were seeing. Chariots. Oh, Nick. The heavy chariots of the Hittite army forded the river south of Kadesh and set off west across the floodplain. Even today, the landscape here is wide and flat, perfect for a massed chariot maneuver. As they splashed across the ford, the Hittite animals would start at a trot. Then they built to a canter, and finally a full gallop. Quote, "The wretched one of Hatti came with his troops and his chariots and the numerous foreign lands that accompanied him. They crossed the river south of Kadesh, and they entered in among his person's troops as they marched unawares. The Hittites attacked the division of Ra at its middle as they were marching and not prepared for fighting. Thus, his person's troops and chariots collapsed before them." End quote. Riding hard, the Hittites cut through Ra division like a knife through fat. In the art, we see the chariots streaming forth along the riverbanks and plains. 3 men to a cart, horses at full gallop, they drive forward, one after another. On the walls of temples, the image is grand and dramatic. Endless waves of heavily armed warriors and their carts. The Hittites charged headlong into the Ra division. The impact was devastating. The battalion was overwhelmed and scattered to the 4 winds. Actual casualties may have been relatively light. As Ramesses tells it, his troops quailed or gave way, Kadesh, rather than fighting, so the resistance might have been minimal. Additionally, the Hittites did not stop to encircle and destroy Ra. Instead, Ramesses reports that, quote, they entered in among the troops on their way north to where his person was. At this point, Mu'attali's strategy becomes clear. He had got the drop on Ramesses. Now, he wanted to kill him, or at least capture him. Fair enough, that is a perfectly sensible goal if you're fighting a monarchy. And so far, the plan was going perfectly. The Hittite chariots completed their drive through Ra division and then turned north, heading for the Egyptian camp. As far as we can tell, Ramesses and his officers were still completely unaware that the attack had physically started. Next time we hear from them, the king is still engaged in his council. Quote, then his person had the companions summoned into the royal presence to let them hear all the words that the 2 Hittites had said. His person said to the officials, you see the situation. The royal officers stand around every day and say to the king, the wretched one of Hatti is in the land of Aleppo, north of Tunip. So they say, speaking to his person every day. But behold, I have heard this very hour from these 2 scouts that the wretched one of Hatti has already come, with the numerous foreign lands accompanying him with men and chariots, as many as the sands of the shore. Behold, they stand hidden behind old Kadesh. And yet, officers and vassals, in whose charge are the lands of the pharaoh, they could not tell us that Hatti had arrived. End quote. The king was furious. Why had nobody reported the approach of the Hittite army? What was the point of vassals and local representatives if they couldn't even observe a massive force moving through Syria? The courtiers, apparently, gave a craven response. Quote, the companions, who were in the royal presence, spoke and replied to the good God. They said, it is a great crime that the officers and vassals have committed, not causing the location of the wretched one of Hatti, wherever he is, to be reported to them, so that they might report it to the pharaoh. End quote. Everyone gathers and tries to pass the blame around, but reading between the lines, the intelligence failure rings loud and clear. Ramesses' account is surprisingly forthright about this failure. Even though he's furious and the courtiers are shirking responsibility, there is one clear issue. Ramesses had accepted the testimony of the Shasu Bedouin and moved forward near Kadesh on that intelligence. He doesn't claim some remarkable foresight or cunning, that he had seen through the ruse and paused in his approach. Whatever else was going wrong in the strategic context, the king, personally, had made a serious error in judgment. Historians have not been kind to Ramesses for this, and in some of my more flippant moments, I too have thrown criticism at the pharaoh. But as Professor Peter Brand points out, the sheer fact that the Kadesh inscriptions admit this failure is quite remarkable for its honesty. Egyptian royal texts usually obscure the pharaoh's mistakes. The king is supposed to be a superhuman being above the concerns of ordinary mortals. That is the religious component of their identity. But Ramesses strips away some of that varnish, and he shows himself to be a fallible human. Granted, there is also a literary function to this, because in a moment the king is going to go forth as a warrior, and make good his mistake with the strength of his arms and ferocity. But the fact remains that among royal military narratives, Ramesses' admission of a mistake is quite revealing for its honesty. And at least in a literary sense, he deserves some credit for that admission. The debate and recriminations swirled within the royal tent. Unfortunately, all of this was taking up valuable time, and as Ramesses tells it, while he and the courtiers were engaged in this blame-sharing, the Hittite attack on Ra division had already transpired, and now the enemy chariots were approaching the Egyptian camp. Soon, the assault began. Quote, "Then the foes from the wretched one of Hatti surrounded the followers of his person, Ramesses, those who were by his side. The forward troops, Amun division, were in camp, which they were setting up and manning, and the king of Hattiland attacked with his army." End quote. Ramesses' description is brief, but we can extract some details. The Hittite chariots arrived while the Amun division was still erecting their camp. The troops were unprepared, still erecting their camp. We see this in the art. As the battle begins, soldiers within the enclosure are busy at various duties. Some of them offload supplies from the pack animals, donkeys and oxen. Others are feeding those animals and the horses of the chariots. Physicians are treating injuries. Soldiers are stringing bows. Artisans assemble and repair the chariots themselves. We see water skins hanging from wooden tripods, with men drinking thirstily from the spout like an animal suckling at a teat. Porters carry boxes hanging from poles slung over their shoulders. We even see Ramesses' pet lion, called Slayer of his Foes, who reclines in the middle of the camp while a caretaker watches him. The picture is one of bustle and preparation as the army moves from marching order into a settled stance. If these images are accurate, and not just condensing various ideas into a single freeze frame, then the enemy might have caught the Egyptians with their kilts down. And as the king says, much of this happened while the royal court was still engaged in council. Ready or not, the attack began. Around 2:30 p.m., give or take, chaos burst upon the Egyptian camp. Trumpets blared, screams rose from the perimeter, and suddenly the enemy were among them. From the art and inscriptions, the Hittite chariots appear to have hit the western part of the camp first. Maybe this area was less protected, or perhaps as they drove away from the Ra division, the Hittites followed a road or route that brought them slightly westward. By this point, the Egyptians were scrambling. Trumpets blared, sounding the call to arms, and as the enemy struck, foot soldiers ran to grab their weapons and shields. Soon, a violent melee began. Highlighting the danger, one scene shows Ramesses' sons riding away from the fight. Two princes, only one of whom is named, stand in their chariots while drivers lash the reins. Behind them, the prince's caretaker shouts out instructions. Quote, "The arrival of the fan-bearer of Pharaoh, life, prosperity, health, to tell the king's children, do not leave by the western side of the camp. Stay clear of the battle." It's a fun detail, and it agrees with the idea that the Hittites struck the western side first. These princes were probably 10 years old, and they had likely joined their father in expectation of a straightforward campaign. This was quite the opposite. But it's nice to see that Ramesses had taken thought for his sons and sent a messenger to keep them safe. As the assault began, Pharaoh was in his tent. As he tells it, the king was enraged, filled with divine anger. The Hittites had come, danger was all around, but Pharaoh would not shirk from battle. Like a god of war, the king would strike back. Quote, "His person caught sight of the enemy, so he arose quickly. He raged at them like his father Montu. He took up his panoply of war. He clothed himself with his coat of armor. He was like Sutekh or Baal in his moment of power." End quote. The king rises and compares himself to 3 mighty gods. Montu, the lord of Waset and a deity of war. Sutekh, the lord of Avaris and the great of strength. and even Baal, the Canaanite storm god, who thundered over the hills and smote enemies with lightning. Ramesses, as a divine king, took on the persona of these warrior gods. Their strength was with him in his moment. Ramesses mentions his armor. What did that look like? 200 years ago, early researchers visited the great temples of Ramesses, monuments like Abu Simbel and the Ramesseum. Back then, there was still paint surviving on many walls, and they recorded the colors, especially for the Kadesh scenes. In one image from the Ramesseum, the pharaoh wears a long robe down to his shins, which is entirely covered with scales. Rows of small plates, alternating blue and yellow, protect his body and upper arms. The scales are probably bronze, sewn onto a garment of leather or quilted fabric. Armor like the one that Ramesses shows does survive archaeologically. The best example comes from the tomb of King Tutankhamun. There was a bundle of scale armor stuffed into a box. The fabric had rotted away, but scholars have been able to reconstruct the garment based on the surviving pieces. Fortunately, Egyptian artists also showed this armor in tombs, and pieces of armor survive from sites like Pi Ramesses and even regions as far afield as the Near East and the Aegean. So researchers can examine those sources, and we can imagine the king's appearance. Stepping out of his tent, the royal body glittered with polished bronze scales. Following the same scene, the pharaoh took up his blue crown, the kepresh, and he summoned his war cart. From the pharaoh's stable, a glittering chariot arrived. At its head, 2 mighty steeds. One horse was named Nekhet Waset, or Victory in Waset, modern Luxor. The other was named Mut Cherep, or Mut is pleased, referencing the mother goddess of that southern city. From the art, we can see that they trotted forth, covered in rich caparisons, colored brightly with blues, yellows, and reds. On the yoke of the chariot, a golden sun disk glittered, and we know that is a physical reality thanks to chariots from the tomb of Tutankhamun. The chariot was duly delivered by Pharaoh's driver. His name was Mena, meaning established, and he was the Keni, or shield-bearer of the king, which, in the context of Egyptian chariots, meant he was also the driver, handling protection and the reins simultaneously. Ramesses mentions him later in the narrative, and we see Mena in the art, standing with the courtiers, the king's horses and war cart glittering and ready. It was time to ride. As chaos unfolded in the camp, the pharaoh took up his bow. Resplendent in his armor, he called forth to his companions to board their chariots, and his bodyguard, a mixed force of Egyptian soldiers and Sherden, the sea peoples. They gathered together around the person of the pharaoh and prepared to counter-attack. At this point, the narrative is going to become rather dramatic. It emphasizes Ramesses as a lone warrior going single-handedly against his foe. But that is a trope of Egyptian art and royal storytelling. The king, superhuman, triumphs against all foes without any assistance. In reality, of course, there would have been a large contingent behind him. But be prepared, this is going to get bombastic. Mena lashed the reins, the horses began to trot, and Ramesses drove forth to face the Hittite peril. Quote, "His person set forth at a gallop. He plunged into the midst of the forces of the Hittite enemy. He was entirely alone, no one else was with him. The king paid no heed to even 1,000,000 foreigners. He looked upon them as mere dust. Thus, his person entered into the enemy ranks, being like Sutekh, great of strength, and Sekhmet in the moment of her fury. He slew all the troops of the wretched one of Hatti, along with his great chiefs and his brothers, likewise all the rulers of the foreign lands that had come with Hatti, and their troops and their chariots, fallen upon their faces, one atop another." End quote. The chariot picked up speed as Mena built the momentum. Riding through the camp, soldiers scattered out of the way of the pharaoh and his bodyguards. In the art, the king rides full gallop. His chariot is kitted out with multiple quivers, and Ramesses draws his bow to its fullest extent. Naturally, Ramesses claims to have overthrown the Hittites with ease, like a storm bolt hurled by the gods. Based on what we know of chariot fighting, this was probably an exchange of arrow fire more than a melee. The chariots would swerve and circle one another as the drivers maintained momentum and balance, and the archers loosed their darts. For the king, it was a moment of great fury. As Mena urged the horses on, Ramesses would nock an arrow, aim his bow, draw full length, and loose. Again and again, he sighted his targets and unleashed. Ramesses claims that he was alone, no one else with him, lacking even a shield-bearer. We know that last part is not true because Mena was his shield-bearer, and he appears in the art and later in the text. As for the rest, how far do we believe that? Realistically, it's quite unlikely that Ramesses was actually physically alone. The image of the warrior pharaoh triumphing single-handedly is an important trope of pharaonic iconography and storytelling, so Ramesses is just fulfilling an expected role. To give the king his due, it does sound like he led his troops from the front. That, at least, is perfectly believable. Humans can be incredibly brave when the moment calls for it, and riding ahead of everyone else, with dust kicked up from chariot wheels, the king may at times have seemed genuinely isolated. None of that is to negate the very real danger in which Ramesses found himself. Riding forth from the camp, leading his bodyguard, the king charged into the midst of the enemy. At times, he may have seemed surrounded by foes. You may be wondering, how large was the Hittite force? Ramesses claims that the Hittite chariot numbers were massive. Describing the battle, the king says, quote, "His person went to look around him. He found 2,500 chariots hemming him in, being all the champions of the Hittite foe, along with the numerous foreign countries who were with him." End quote. As Ramesses tells it, he rode into a veritable sea of enemies. 2,500 chariots would require 5,000 horses and 7,500 soldiers. Can we believe that? It's tricky. The king of Hatti had good reason to send a large force, given what he was attempting to surprise and destroy an enemy while they were making camp. Mu'atali probably wanted to hit hard. A sizable contingent driving headlong would give the momentum necessary to scatter enemy troops and take down the pharaoh. However, chariots are not like traditional cavalry. Every cart requires far more space to turn and maneuver than your classic man on horseback. With that in mind, Mu'atali had to balance the strength of his force with the physical limitations of the maneuver. If the attacking group were too large, they might get in each other's way, or they might form a bottleneck while fording the river Orontes. If that happened, they could lose their element of surprise. The fact that Mu'atali was able to unleash his attack smoothly suggests that they had planned this carefully, and it probably meant they did not send 2,500 chariots all at once. A conservative estimate might say 500, or perhaps 1,000 in the initial attacking wave. That would still be 2,000 horses and 3,000 men, fewer than the Egyptians, but heavily armed and with the element of surprise to back them up. As for the others, well, they could have come behind as a reinforcement or a second wave of troops. We'll come back to that a bit later. Anyway, 1,000 chariots with 2,000 horses and 3,000 warriors. Smaller than the Egyptian force, but heavily armed and with the element of surprise to back them up. A very real danger to the division of Amun and to the pharaoh. Soon, a running battle was taking place around the camp perimeter, and Ramesses and his bodyguards found themselves in the midst of the enemy host. At this point, the narrative does something remarkable. Surrounded by foes, Ramesses almost admits to fear. The literary account now takes a moment to record a speech by the king aimed at his father Amun, the king of the gods, lord of Karnak, the hidden power in all creation. If anyone could resolve this slightly difficult situation, surely it was Amun. Ramesses now begged his father for aid. Quote, "Then spoke his person, the king, saying, 'What is happening with you, my father Amun? Has a father abandoned his son? Have I done anything without you? Do I not go and stop at your word? I have never disobeyed any plan that you commanded. O Amun, have I not made monuments for you in great multitude? And I gave to you all my wealth by decree. I presented to you every land in its entirety to supply your sacred offerings. I neglected no good deed. I built for you great pylon towers, and I erected their flagstaffs myself. I brought for you obelisks from Abu, Elephantine. I directed ships on the sea to carry for you the products of foreign countries." End quote. There is a note of desperation in Ramesses' prayer, but the king also seems annoyed that his father is not assisting. Understandable, if the situation was as dire as it sounds. And in the first years of his rule, Ramesses had been a pious builder. Some of the monuments he describes had been commissioned in those early days. Basically, Ramesses had done what Amun wanted, so where was the god when the king really needed him? At this point, Ramesses makes possibly my favorite speech in all royal literature. Having bemoaned his situation to Amun, the king now scolds his divine father. Quote, "How great is Amun, the lord of Egypt, to allow foreigners to approach this way? What are they to you, these Easterners, who are wretched and ignorant of the god? What will people think if even a minor mishap befalls the one who depended on your counsel? Do good to him who counts upon you, then people will serve you with a will." End quote. In his desperation, Pharaoh shows a startling temerity. Reading between the lines, Ramesses sounds fearful. Fearful enough that he actually threatens the god. For if Amun would not help his own son, why should anyone believe or worship him? It's a remarkable passage in the circumstances, highlighting the sheer tension of the battle unfolding. Lest we forget, Ramesses takes a moment to complain that his army has scattered. Finishing his speech to the god, Ramesses proclaims, quote, "When I kept on shouting out to the soldiers, none of them heeded me. But Amun is more help to me than 1,000,000 soldiers, than 100,000 chariots, more than 10,000 men, even if they were brothers, united in one heart. There is no achievement of however many men, but Amun is more help than all of them. I have learned this much, O Amun, by the advice of your mouth. I have never overstepped your counsel." End quote. Again, Ramesses emphasizes his piety. In the moment of greatest danger, he calls in all the favors that his service might have merited. Surely, if there was any justice, truth, or order in the universe, the god would help the king. Would it work? Yes. Between one breath and the next, Ramesses reports the outcome of his fiery speech. Quote, "Behold the petition that I made from the furthest end of the foreign lands. And yet my voice echoed in Waset. The moment I called out to him, I found that Amun had come. He gave me his hand, being with me, and I was happy. As though face to face, Amun spoke out behind me, saying, 'Forward, I am with you. I am your father. My hand is with you. I am more useful to you than hundreds of thousands of men. I am the Lord of Victory, who loves bravery.'" End quote. In a remarkable turn, the god himself joins Ramesses upon the battlefield, and Ramesses' morale soared. As he tells it, the king's heart was filled with courage and renewed strength. Now he leapt into overdrive and renewed his attack. Quote, "My heart I found strong, my mind was joyful, all that I did was good, I was just like Montu. I shot to my right, I captured to my left, I was like Sutek in his moment, being within the god's sight. I found that the 2,500 Hittite chariots, in whose midst I was, fell prostrate before my horses. None of them could fight, their hearts quailed through fear of me. All their arms were weak, they could not shoot, they could not steady their minds to take up their javelins. I made the enemy plunge into the river like crocodiles, so that they fell upon their faces, one atop the other. I slaughtered them just as I wished. None looked behind him, no other turned around. Whoever of them fell, he did not rise again." End quote. So, with the strength of Amun, Ramesses became Death, the destroyer of worlds. As the king tells it, his divine fury now overpowered the enemy single-handedly. In reality, this was probably the moment when Ramesses and his bodyguard consolidated their position. Having counterattacked, crashing into the Hittite force, they may have carved out a space where they could rally and push further. If this were a movie, it would probably be the moment where Ramesses turns to his followers and calls them to greater feats. Somehow, there would be a fire or explosion behind him, and the Egyptians would cheer as they surged forward, once more unto the breach. The music would kick up, high tempo, and Ramesses would ride into the danger zone. The king and his bodyguard rode around the camp, engaging their foe. By 3:30 p.m., maybe, the battle had been underway for more than an hour. It doesn't sound long, but imagine yourself going full energy at a gym for that long. Then add on armor, equipment, and weaponry, and the intensity of mortal danger. Here, there was little chance of rest, no time to retreat or catch one's breath. Maybe when the arrows ran out and a chariot returned for ammunition, one might snatch a moment of calm. But that assumes that the attack within the Egyptian camp was quietening down, and that we just don't know. Chances are that proper rest simply wasn't an option. Round and round went the chariots. Arrows flew, turning shields to pincushions. Javelins thudded in the dirt or struck the sides of carts. Warriors tumbled out, pierced by the shafts. The horses screamed when hit, and those that didn't were probably coated in sweat, breathing hard, mouths foaming with saliva. And all the while, the drivers urged them on, and the archers loosed their arrows. As the battle swirled, the Egyptian chariots seemed to have forced the Hittites east and south. In the art, we see the battle taking place largely beside the river Orontes, which was between the Egyptian camp and Kadesh itself. As always, that is iconography, not reality. But given that chariots need space, and they would be constantly maneuvering for a shot, it's quite possible the battle attained its own momentum and slowly swung away from the camp. That may have been a relief for the Amun division, who were, at best, struggling to reorder themselves after the initial attack. Meanwhile, Ramesses and his warriors drove harder into the foe. Quote, "His person was after them like a griffin. I slaughtered among them without letting up. The enemies cried out to each other, saying, 'This is no mere man that is among us. It is Sutek, the great of power. It is Baal in person. The things that he does are not the acts of a mere human. They belong to one who is utterly unique. One who defeats multitudes, even though there are no troops with him, no chariots. Quickly, let us come away, flee before him, seek life for ourselves, so that we may breathe air. Behold, anyone who would go forth to approach the pharaoh, his hand and limbs go weak. No one can draw a bow or wield a spear when they see him coming, even when he charges from a great distance." End quote. Again, the art shows this dramatic moment, and it does so grandly. At multiple temples, you can find Ramesses in his chariot riding headlong into the foe, and the Hittites positively collapse before his onslaught. Ramesses' arrows plunge into their chest, throwing them backwards head over heels. Enemy chariots overturn, their horses tumbling and falling, their drivers thrown from the cart. The Hittites flee from Pharaoh's fury, heading for the river that surrounds Kadesh. Ramesses includes the Orontes in his battle scenes, and he shows the enemy tumbling into the waters. Is this reality, or the artistic expression of pharaonic victory as a concept? At best, it's a bit of both. One of the dramatic details that the Egyptians include are captions naming their enemies. Somehow, the Egyptian scribes learned the identity of individual officers among the Hittite army, and they included them in the forces who scatter before the pharaoh. Among that list, we find notable names like Tiatali, chief of the bodyguard of the Wretched One of Hatti; Agamu, the troop commander of the Wretched One; Tudila, chief of the Tuhir troops; and, most excellently, we have the ruler of Aleppo, the city where Muwatalli claimed he was waiting while deceiving the pharaoh. The prince of Aleppo appears in the art, being dragged out of the river. Apparently the prince had got himself rather waterlogged, and his attendants had to lift him upside down, hanging by his feet, to get the water out. We see this happening in the art at multiple temples. The Hittite soldiers literally lift the prince up and shake him about. Hieroglyphs describe it as, "The wretched ruler of Aleppo, he being emptied of water by his troops, after the pharaoh had thrown him into the river." It's a wonderfully fun detail. According to Ramesses' account, the first wave of Hittite chariots was crumbling before Egypt's counterattack. Ideologically, we see this as a moment of triumph when the forces of order pushed back the forces of chaos. Speaking of chaos, where was the enemy leader? As Pharaoh tells it, the great king of Hatti was not getting involved in the battle directly. Instead, he was standing back, in the rear, with his army. Quote, "Now, the wretched ruler of Hatti was standing amidst his infantry and chariots, watching the attack by his person, Ramesses. The Hittite just stood, turning away, cringing. He could not come out to fight, through fear of Ramesses, when he saw his person conquering the troops of Hatti." End quote. Geographically, Muwatalli probably wasn't near the Egyptian camp. Instead, he seems to have stood upon a hill near Kadesh on the eastern bank of Orontes. That makes sense. If you are coordinating this kind of strategy, you need a good vantage point, and you can't get tied up in the combat directly. While Ramesses could hurl accusations of cowardice, it didn't change the fundamental fact. Muwatalli still held the high ground, figuratively and literally. Notably, Muwatalli himself appears in the art. At multiple temples, you can find the great king standing in his chariot, surrounded by orderly ranks of troops. Hieroglyphs identify him as, quote, "the wretched one of Hatti, Pa Chesi en Cheta," or more simply, the vile Hittite. Visually, Muwatalli is contrasted strongly with the pharaoh. Where Ramesses rides alone into the foe, Muwatalli is always surrounded by his troops. And the art always shows the Hittite facing away from the king of Egypt. Muwatalli stands in a chariot that seems ready to flee, and he usually looks back over his shoulder, as if he were too cowardly, too impressed by Ramesses' strength to dare face him fully. His timidity is made twice as notable by the fact he's usually on the other side of the river that flows around Kadesh. At a glance, the Hittite could not be safer. But of course, the Egyptian royal narrative demands that his enemy be a coward, that he is unable to resist the divine might of Pharaoh. It's a little bit comical amid the serious drama of battle. Whatever cowardice Ramesses alleged, Muwatalli still held the advantage. Pharaoh and his followers had resisted one attack from a single chariot force. But as we saw earlier, this was probably a small portion of the Hittites' overall army, and as the first assault blunted and slowly began to fall back, Muwatalli sent reinforcements. Quote, "Then the wretched ruler of Hatti sent forth many chiefs, each one of them with his chariots and equipped with their fighting weapons. There was the ruler of Arzawa, of Massa, Arwana, of Lucca, of Dardania, the ruler of Carchemish, of Karkisha, and Aleppo. The brothers of the Hittite ruler all assembled together. They united as 1,000 chariot teams, and they came straight on." End quote. A second wave of charioteers set off. Presumably, this new army started marching once the first was clear and on the road. Given the time required to reach their destinations, it seems unlikely that Muwatalli would wait for things to go bad and then send reinforcements. Unfortunately, Ramesses' narrative is a bit hazy with the timing, and he presents the new wave once the first is already being defeated. Maybe that is accurate, but perhaps it's more likely the battle was still going when the second army approached. Notably, the new force included Muwatalli's foreign allies. We introduced these last episode, when the great king assembled such warriors as Hurrians from Mitanni, Kaskans from the Black Sea coast, and even Dardanians, who might be an early group of Trojans. Now, Ramesses mentions these folks once again as part of the new attacking force. Apparently, they also included the brother of Muwatalli, who is later named as, quote, Sipazili, the brother of the Wretched One. Perhaps the Egyptians captured that prince after the battle and learned who he was, or he fell amidst his bodyguards and was identified later. Either way, Pharaoh claims to have taken down at least one of Muwatalli's brothers. So as the first assault began to slow, a second wave arrived. Ramesses and his forces, now fighting outside the camp, were facing an entirely new and fresh army. This force, allegedly, numbered 1,000 chariots. Just as the Egyptians were getting their balance, a new army attacked. Once again, the pharaoh was in mortal danger. At some point, maybe in the midst of this new attack, Ramesses' driver lost his nerve. As the king tells it, the charioteer and shield-bearer Menna was distraught at the sight of this enemy. The narrative says, quote, "Now, when Menna, my shield-bearer, saw that a huge number of chariots surrounded me, then he was dismayed. His heart sank, terrible fear possessed his body. Thus Menna said to the king, 'My good lord, mighty ruler, we stand alone in the midst of the foe. Behold, our troops and chariots have abandoned us. Why do you stay in order to save them? Let us get clear. Save us, O king.'" End quote. We have no way of knowing if this happened or not. In terms of the story, Menna's panic illustrates a key point, that while Ramesses' troops had failed to stay brave and loyal, the king did not abandon them in turn. Ramesses' scribe, composing this text, has Menna say the theme out loud, just in case any reader had missed it. Of course, the pharaoh does not abandon his followers, even if they abandon him. And Ramesses replies, quote, "Then his persons said, 'Be firm, be bold-hearted, my shield-bearer. I shall go into the enemy like the lunge of a falcon, killing, slaughtering, felling to the ground. What are these cowards to you, for whom I care nothing?'" End quote. Ramesses uses the speech to further denigrate his foes, calling them chemetiu, literally effeminate or like wives, and he promises to cut them down like trees. Bold words in the circumstances, but the fact that Menna, supposedly, was despairing suggests that the battle was still on a knife's edge. If the second wave arrived shortly, before the first was entirely defeated, the weight of numbers might prove overwhelming. And when the Hittites saw that reinforcements were coming, their morale would soar, and they might surge with a new adrenaline. Ramesses' language paints a picture of himself as an overwhelming force against whom none could stand. In reality, things were probably still in doubt. Ra division was scattered, and might not be effective for hours or days to come. Ptah division should be hurrying north, messengers having reached them by now, but they would not arrive for several hours yet. As for Sutek, well, who knows? The point is, the 4 main divisions marching along the road were still otherwise engaged, which only left somewhere in this sweep of battle, the timing is unclear, Ramesses' 5th column appeared, a force of elite warriors called the Sekhet Pay, or First Battle Line, had not marched on Kadesh directly. They had gone by the coastal route north into Amurru, and then approached the city from the north and west. According to the art and texts, these troops arrived on the battlefield in the midst of the enemy attack. You can imagine the Hittite surprise when the western hills suddenly echoed with trumpets. Waves of infantry, rank after rank, crested the peaks or threaded through the valleys. In the art, the new force appears as a huge mass of troops. Marching orderly, armed with spears and shields, they come towards the camp. The troops wear their hair long, possibly with leather caps, and their body armor looks like a leather girdle wrapped around the torso. On some temples, they carry swords and daggers. At their head, a new force of chariots lead the way, horses fresh, arrow quivers full, ready to do battle. Quote, "The arrival of the army of Pharaoh, life, prosperity, health, coming from the land of Amurru. They found that the hostile ranks of the wretched one of Hatti had surrounded the camp of Pharaoh on its western side. The new troops attacked these hostile ranks who had penetrated the camp. They let none of them escape. Their hearts were confident in the great strength of their good lord, the king, he being around his troops like a mountain of copper, like a wall of iron, forever and always." End quote. The reinforcement army emerged from the western hills and plunged into the flanks of the Hittites. Notably, Ramesses calls his 5th column the Na'arin, which is a Semitic word from the Near East, not Egyptian. Scholars have puzzled over this. Were the Na'arin the same as the Sekhet Pay, just called by a different name? If they're not, then what happened to those Sekhet Pay who went through Amurru? The Na'arin are coming from the same region, so the simple answer may be that these two forces are one and the same. But why call them by a different name? Well, maybe the new relief force included vassals like Amorites and Canaanites, whom the Sekhet Pay had gathered on their march. In that scenario, the relief force might have a large component of Semitic troops, quote-unquote. It's a whole academic debate, and I won't bore you with it. But following scholars like Frédéric Servajon, I would argue that the Na'arin and the Sekhet Pay are one and the same. Identity questions aside, the arrival of the Na'arin seems to have been a great relief to the Egyptian army. Marching from the west, they arrived at precisely the right moment. Now, it was the Hittites' turn to be caught off guard. Again, the timing is unclear. Did the new army save the Egyptians, turning the tide entirely against the Hittites? Or had Ramesses, his followers, and the division of Amun managed to stabilize the situation, only to be reinforced by these Na'arin troops? Alas, Ramesses' narrative is so focused on himself as the warrior pharaoh that we simply don't get a clear strategic timetable. I've put the new arrival here at this point in the narrative, but it could easily go earlier. As the reinforcements arrived from the west, the battle near the Egyptian camp reached its climax. By now, it was probably going on 4:30 or so, maybe later. The first Hittite attack had been blunted. The second was starting to engage. But the Egyptians had received reinforcements in the form of the Na'arin. At this point, we lose track of the larger picture and remain on the ground. Quote, "I defeated all the foreign lands, being alone, my troops and chariots having abandoned me. As Ra lives for me and loves me, and as my father Atum favors me, regarding everything of which my person has spoken, truly I did these things in the presence of my troops and chariots. I was after them like a griffin." End quote. You can see a theme emerging ad nauseum. of the lone hero overpowering the enemy single-handedly. The king compares himself to a griffin, or achech, which appears in the hieroglyphs as a small horse-like animal with a bird's head, prominent donkey-like ears, and wings. That kind of composite beast, similar to a winged sphinx or the creature of Sutekh, tends to convey, metaphorically, the power, ferocity, and energy of the king. Literary themes aside, the battle probably reached its greatest intensity here. Ramesses makes a mention to his father Atum. I might be reading too much into this, but Atum is the evening form of Ra, so the fact the king mentions him now might indicate that the day was starting to grow long. That's just speculation, don't take my word for it. As the Egyptians built momentum, the Hittites began to fall back. Again, the artistic scenes give an idea of what may have happened. We see enemy warriors plunging into the Orontes, fleeing for safety. Some of them reach the opposite bank, where their comrades lift them from the water. Others, unfortunately, drown or die with arrows in their backs. Then the chariots flee along the riverside. Some of them head for Kadesh itself. At Luxor Temple, you can see one chariot half obscured behind the city itself, as if he was entering the gate amid the walls. Again, the pharaoh's attack overwhelms those who stand to fight, and we see the enemy tumbling from their carts, while horses leap and fall in confusion. Rhetoric aside, the arrival of the reinforcement army and the securing of the camp seems to have salvaged the Egyptian position. At this point, with the sun heading towards the western horizon, the enemy attack began to slow. Eventually, it stopped, and the Hittites started to withdraw. The day was done. The battle came to an end. The next that we hear of things, the sun had started to set, and Ramesses' forces were regrouping. Quote, "My soldiers presented themselves one by one, approaching the camp at the time of sunset. They found all the foreign lands amongst whom I had gone, lying overthrown in their blood. I had made white the countryside of the land of Kadesh. None could find a space to tread, by reason of their sheer number." End quote. Ramesses describes the countryside as turning white, which is a bit vague. We could take it two ways. Metaphorically, it might mean the blood had drained from Ramesses' foes by fear or by death, leaving their corpses pale across the landscape. Alternatively, it might be a literal reference to the Hittites themselves. 2 centuries ago, when a wave of European scholars began documenting the Battle of Kadesh scenes, some of them still preserved their paint. That included the temples of Abu Simbel and the Ramesseum, where men like Champollion, Rossellini, and Priest d'Aven made drawings and paintings with some of the colors intact. In these copies, we find that Ramesses depicted the Hittites as a creamy beige, contrasting with the red-brown of the Egyptians. At the risk of taking things too literally, Ramesses' description of turning the land white might refer to the number of enemy bodies, with their relatively light skin. Perhaps, if there were enough of these pale folk lying in the dust, the land itself may have seemed much lighter than the rich soil of Kemet, the Black Land. Maybe I'm reading too much into that. Make of it what you will. Ramesses reports the soldiers trickling back to camp. Presumably, this included warriors of Ra division, making their way to the enclosure after danger had passed. As the king describes it, the army was amazed to see what he had achieved. Quote, "When my troops and my chariots saw me, that I was like Montu, my arm strong. Then my army came to praise me. My officers came to extol my victorious arm. Likewise, my charioteers boasted of my name, and they said, 'What a fine warrior, who strengthens the heart! that you should rescue your troops and chariots. Behold, you are the son of Amun, achieving with his arms. You devastate the land of Hatti by your victorious arm. You are the finest warrior without equal. O protector of Kemet, who curbs the foreign lands, you have broken the back of Hatti forever." End quote. Again, the literary theme is that of Ramesses the hero, the savior of his cowardly army. We may roll our eyes, but to give the king the benefit of the doubt, his counterattack, and those of his entourage and bodyguard, may genuinely have been instrumental. Of course, he wasn't fighting single-handed, but he was fighting in the thick of it, and his courage could have been a genuine inspiration in the moments of terror. Whatever one may think of Ramesses' personality, that he seems boastful or arrogant, we probably should give him the due. He was a capable and courageous warrior. The same apparently could not be said for his troops. As the acclamations roll over the king, Ramesses turns to his forces and scolds them. Quote, "Thus his person spoke to his troops and his officers and his charioteers, saying, 'What is wrong with you, my soldiers? You do not know how to fight. Does a man not make himself honored in his city when he has played the hero before his lord? His good name, won in battle, is beautiful indeed, and a man is respected because of his strong arm. Have I not done good to even one of you, that you should abandon me amidst the strife? What will be said in gossip when it is heard that you abandoned me, I being left alone?'" End quote. There is some ambiguity about whom Ramesses is berating exactly. Is he talking to the army as a whole, or is he just talking to Ra division, those who quailed before the enemy? So far, the tale has emphasized Ramesses as the lone warrior, but at this part of the tale, the ones trickling back to camp were probably those troops of Ra. I wonder if his scorn is reserved for them, or if he's blaming everyone for the failures of a few. Perhaps it's the latter, because in the next breath, the king singles out the one team that stood by him through thick and thin. Amidst the recriminations, Ramesses takes time to thank his loyal friends, his horses. Quote, "No officer, chariot warrior, or soldier came to assist me. I repulsed 1,000,000 foreigners on my own. Behold, it was only my great chariot steeds, named Victory in Waset and Mut is Content, whom I found to help me. I shall bend down to feed those horses myself, every day when I am in the palace." End quote. That is a fun detail, that Ramesses genuinely appreciated the bravery of his war horses, and that they did their job amidst the sounds, smells, and fury of battle. Hopefully, the king kept true to his word and fed these horses every day in the great stable of Pharaoh, which was located in Ramesses. That would be nice to know. At this point, the king ends his narrative of the day. You can imagine that night brought a measure of relief for the soldiers and the followers. Warriors may have washed themselves in the water of Orontes, keeping a wary eye on Kadesh as the sun set. In the Egyptian enclosure, soldiers divested themselves of armor and weaponry. They cleaned their bodies as best as they could. They snatched a meal, and then they probably collapsed in sleep. It had been a long day. In his tent, Ramesses probably took a bath, attendants pouring water over him from jugs. His mother, Toya, may have turned up, wherever she had been. Likewise, his sons, at least 2 of whom appear in the art, but who had escaped the fighting on their chariots. Hopefully, they were none the worse for wear. Probably quite alarmed, or maybe excited, depending on their age. Finally, there were the non-combatants, supply workers and members of the extended royal staff, who slowly collected themselves and organized the camp. As darkness fell, they too settled into rest. I imagine it was a watchful night for the guards, looking out over the plain. Across the river, Kadesh's walls loomed black, perhaps glimmering with torches atop the battlements. To the east, behind a hill, there may have been a faint glow from the camp of Hatti, as 40,000 soldiers, minus a few, lit their campfires and settled to their beds. Above, the stars emerged from the firmament. The Milky Way, the body of Nut, may have glittered overhead. As the sun set over Kadesh, Ramesses had triumphed. Sort of. But retiring to his bed, he probably had a lot to reflect upon. Just 14 hours earlier, give or take, Ramesses' day had started so smoothly. An orderly march out of the Bekaa Valley, heading to a camp west of Kadesh. But then events had spiraled rapidly, and it was at least partly Ramesses' own fault. The king of Hatti, Muwatalli, had pulled off a remarkable deception, managing to move an entire army south from Aleppo without raising alarms. Unfortunately, Egyptian spies and vassals had failed to identify, or at least report, that maneuver. Then, Ramesses had compounded that failure by accepting the testimony of two strangers, the Shasu Bedouin. This had cost him dearly, as the king found himself attacked unexpectedly by a powerful Hittite force. The fact that Ramesses was able to defend his camp, stabilize the situation, and eventually push the Hittites back was remarkable. Today, we may doubt aspects of his account. The "I did it all by myself, no other with me," that is clearly a literary theme rather than physical reality. However, there is no substantial reason to doubt the king's personal bravery. He may very well have plunged into the midst of his enemy, leading his courtiers on their chariots and his bodyguard on foot. Of course, we will never know the complete, unvarnished truth, and even as the sun set, that reality was starting to fade in the surge of emotions that came with such an ordeal. This was undeniably the most dramatic day of Ramesses' life, swinging from bold confidence and comfortable security to the utmost confusion and terror, then to the surge of adrenaline and fury in the fight, finally to the relief of reinforcements, and perhaps the intoxicating thrill of the battle itself, and emerging unscathed. Thinking on the after-action reports of soldiers throughout history, Ramesses and many of his warriors may have felt a touch of the sublime. Across the valley, Muwatalli also had much to consider. His plan had started flawlessly. A surprise attack, launched at great distance, had scattered one Egyptian division and then surrounded their camp. After that, though, the best-laid plan had gone startlingly awry. The fact remained that Muwatalli had failed in his key objective. He had not destroyed the division of Amun, and he had not captured or killed Ramesses, which is quite clearly what he was attempting to do with the surprise attack. While we don't have the full facts, and probably never will, there might have been an error in Muwatalli's approach. It concerns that surprise attack itself. If we accept Ramesses' descriptions of the battlefield, the Hittite chariot force appears to have made a lengthy journey on their way to launching the assault. First, they had left their camp about 10 kilometers northeast of Kadesh. They had ridden south to the Orontes, forded the river, crossed the floodplain, attacked the Ra division, then swung north before reaching the enemy camp. Then they had fought a running battle with Ramesses and Amun. At a conservative estimate, the Hittite chariots had gone at least 18 kilometers, or 11 miles, over rough terrain, and that was before even reaching their target. That is no small feat, for the horses, pulling heavy carts, and 3 riders, armed with equipment and weaponry. And at the end of all that riding, they needed to engage in a battle, one that apparently stretched over hours. Such an approach gambled heavily on the key advantage of chariots, speed. Unfortunately, that advantage is fragile and difficult to maintain, but maintain it you must. Modern films often give the impression that chariots operated like tanks, smashing holes in the enemy line and wreaking bloody havoc. Historically, though, the late Bronze Age chariot was much less of a tank and more of a pickup truck armed with a machine gun. That is, they were mobile archery platforms rather than heavily armored knights. Granted, the Hittite chariots were heavier with their larger crew, but even that couldn't fundamentally change their role. The chariot worked when it kept moving. With that in mind, as soon as the Hittites broke into the Egyptian camp, entering an enclosed space, they negated one of their primary advantages. I wonder if Muwatalli was hoping to find the Egyptians less prepared than they actually were. To be clear, I am not criticizing Muwatalli. The charioteers had achieved a remarkable success. They had engaged at least one fight, scattering Ra division, which probably did raise their adrenaline and morale, spurring them on to the next phase. But there's no two ways about it. By the time they approached Ramesses and his camp, the Hittites and their horses were far from fresh. And as the surprise attack turned into a slog, their effectiveness would have declined. That may explain why the attack seems to have hit hard initially, before rapidly losing momentum. Finally, the Egyptians weren't quite as caught with your kilt down as Muwatalli may have liked. Certainly, Ra division were completely unprepared. But Amun division, while surprised, were in a much better position. As Ramesses' narrative and art communicate, the Amun division were not fully encamped, but they had started to set up their enclosure. They had established a perimeter, possibly erecting fences or even shields as a temporary fortification. It wasn't the strongest barrier in the world, but it was an obstacle, complicating the Hittite charge. Chariotry, like horsemen, are best used in the open with space to maneuver. A soldier's camp, however rudimentary, presents many barriers. Equipment lying around, tents going up with ropes and poles, weapons and shields stacked where they can be accessed, not to mention all of the people in a small space, with the potential to arm themselves quickly. Even if the Egyptian camp was just starting to go up, the Hittite chariots were leaving their ideal territory and entering a more dangerous environment. Couple that with the fatigue that we just discussed, and Muwatalli's chariot force may have entered a less than perfect situation. Finally, there was the Egyptian counterattack. Whether we believe Ramesses' rhetoric about going it alone, the pharaoh's bodyguards and entourage, including charioteers, seem to have hit back soon after the Hittites arrived. On that front, Muwatalli's force clearly did not catch the Egyptians completely in the open, and unless they got lucky with an arrow or javelin, the odds of capturing or killing Ramesses receded rapidly as the battle heated up. For these reasons, and perhaps many more, the surprise attack had devolved into a slogging match. At that point, the Hittite chariots found themselves at a disadvantage. Their horses were tiring before the fighting even began, and they had entered somewhat difficult terrain. Far from their lord, with messages taking time to travel, it was the Hittite attack that eventually found itself detached from its host. In such circumstances, and with Egyptian reinforcements, the Na'arin, arriving, you can see why they eventually disengaged. These are just my armchair general speculations as to what may have happened in the larger strategic picture. No doubt there are many things that I have not considered, perhaps some that appear to you. If there are aspects to this battle from Ramesses' description that you think are important, do let me know in the comments. Night fell, and the armies slept. Was that the end of the tale? Not quite. If you thought the Battle of Kadesh was over, you would be wrong. There is a day 2. After a quiet but probably restless night, the Egyptians arose before the dawn. The battle was not done. Kadesh remained unconquered, and the Hittites, while bloodied, were still very much in the fight, and they still held the advantage of numbers. The division of Amun might have stabilized. The troops of the Sekhet Pay, or Narin, had arrived, and the royal bodyguard, entourage, and Ramesses himself were gathering in their camp. But across the way, past Kadesh, the Hittite army still outnumbered them, and there was every chance the second day would be even worse than the first. As the sun god Ra crested the hills east of Kadesh, the Egyptian troops began to move. Quote, "When dawn came, I, the king, marshaled the battle line. I was prepared to fight like an eager bull. I appeared to my army like Montu, arrayed in the panoply of valor and victory." End quote. The Egyptian troops mustered and began to move. There would be no attack on their camp today. They were going to face the Hittites directly out in the field. Chances are Ramesses had dispatched his warriors to secure the river fords south and east of Kadesh. If they didn't control those, the Hittites could stream across in ever greater numbers and perhaps, eventually, envelop them. At the very least, it was worth deploying as close as possible to those crossings to limit the numbers they would face. Ramesses does not give us these strategic details. We have to infer them. At best, scholars can say that the two armies moved south of Kadesh in an orderly fashion. Having arrayed across the floodplains, they now engaged in a more set-piece battle. Quote, "I, Ramesses, entered into the battle lines, fighting like the dive of a falcon. My uraeus serpent overthrew my enemies for me. She spat her fiery flame in the faces of my foes. I was like Ra in his shining at the dawn. My rays burned up the bodies of the enemy. One of them called out to his fellows, saying, 'Look out! Don't approach the pharaoh! Behold, Sekhmet the mighty is with him. She is alongside him, upon his horse. Her hand is with him.' The enemies took their stand at a distance, and they did homage before me. But my person seized the foe, killing them without letting up. They sprawled before my horses, lying overthrown in their blood." End quote. That is the entirety of the second day of battle. Ramesses describes it much more briefly than the first, and he emphasizes the divine component in his combat, that the cobra upon his crown, the uraeus, could shoot heat rays, and the violent onslaught of his chariot, although drawn by horses, was more akin to the lioness of Sekhmet. He even puts those fun speeches in the mouths of his enemies. I always like them. There's a real theatrical component to it. But again, the literary theme shines forth. Ramesses, the lone warrior, triumphs utterly. In the circumstances, the more likely scenario is that the two armies faced off in a relatively equal but brief fight. Muwatalli still held the advantage of numbers, but he had lost the element of surprise. And the landscape of Kadesh, bordered by waterways, with just a couple of river crossings, probably didn't allow Hatti to fully deploy their numbers. With that tentative reconstruction in mind, the two sides may have fought each other to a stalemate. And before too long, they withdrew once more and ceased their combat. At an impasse, Ramesses now claims that Muwatalli sent him a message. A royal charioteer departed the Hittite lines and rode towards the Egyptians. Presumably, they signaled peace, although we don't know how. What we do know is Ramesses' description of the envoy. Quote, "Thereupon the wretched, defeated ruler of Hatti sent word, honoring my name like that of Ra. He said to me, 'You are Sutekh, Baal in person, and the fear of you is like a fire in the land of Hatti.'" The Hittite sent his envoy with a letter in his hand, sending greetings to the person of Ramesses. To me, the envoy said, "Behold, you are the true son of Ra, who came forth from his body. As for the land of Egypt and the land of Hatti, they are now yours, your servants, beneath your 2 feet. Ra, your great father, has granted them to you. Please, do not overwhelm us. Your power is great. Is it good that you kill your servants? Behold, you spent yesterday slaughtering myriads, and then you came today, and you left no sons alive. Do not be harsh, O victorious king. Peace is better than war. Grant us the breath of life." End quote. One suspects that Ramesses and his scribes have reworked this message for their Egyptian audience. What did Muwatalli actually send? We really have no idea. The great king might have made some flowery greetings. Cuneiform letters, exchanged between various kingdoms, often include overtures and well-wishing, sometimes really lengthy ad nauseum. But when they write to one another, the great kings never concede inferiority. Certainly, Muwatalli would never have said, "You are the sun god, I am your servant." And the idea that he would offer the land of Hatti as a subject to Ramesses is, quite frankly, beyond belief. At moments like this, we should always remember that these hieroglyph texts carved on the walls of temples are serving an important function within the cosmos. They have to proclaim victory to maintain the divine order. Admissions of defeat, even stalemate, are incompatible with the religious role of the pharaoh. So let's not put it entirely on the king. Ramesses may sound like a blowhard, but there is a deeper function to this language. But where does that leave us with the Hittites? Well, at best, we can say that the 2 armies were stalemated. In the circumstances, the Hittite envoy maybe said something along the lines of, "Look, we've reached an impasse. Let us both withdraw, honorably, and call an end to this fight." That is absolutely my own guess, but looking at the shadowy remains of the tale, certain things are clear. Ramesses had not subjugated the Hittite army, and he certainly hadn't reduced them to servitude. What's more, he had failed to take Kadesh, which was the entire reason he was here. In that sense, he had not achieved his strategic goals. On the other hand, Muwatalli had not achieved his either. The Egyptian army had regrouped following the extraordinary ambush, and they were now in a position that they could face Muwatalli directly. As a further complication, additional Egyptian troops were still arriving. In the morning of the 2nd day, the division of Ptah would have emerged from the Bekaa Valley. That is assuming they didn't make a night march and arrive before the dawn. The division of Sutek, meanwhile, could be expected by day's end, or at very least the next morning. In short, the Egyptian army was going to grow stronger over the next 24 hours. Muwatalli, however, had already played his major cards. He had more troops on the field now, but that wasn't necessarily going to last. Again, speculating, the 2 kings may have reached a rather ambivalent choice. If their armies decided to go all out, continuing the slogging match, there was simply no way of knowing who might win. For us, 3,000 years later, this 2nd day is probably the most tantalizing part of the tale. Ramesses tells it so briefly that there was another fight, that the 2 rulers exchanged messengers, and then the battle came to an end. I would love to know how things really stood in those last couple of hours. The 2 sides disengaged, and we hear no more of fighting. The Battle of Kadesh was done. Thank you for listening to the History of Egypt podcast. Next time, we're going to remain on the battlefield to see the aftermath of Kadesh, how the Egyptians cared for their wounded and dealt with their enemies, both alive and dead. Then we'll see how the 2 sides withdrew from the city, and how, eventually, they both recorded and reminisced on the event. There are more records to explore around this tale. For now, the fighting is done. I hope you've enjoyed the story. The battle between Muwatalli and Ramesses is a remarkably well-recorded affair. From the Egyptian side, the conflict is described in 3 sources. First, there is the grandiose art carved on the pylons and walls of temples, namely Ramesses monuments at Abydos, Luxor, Karnak, the Ramesseum, and Abu Simbel. Along with that, there are columns of hieroglyphs that tell the story in 3 versions. First, there are short captions, or epigraphs, scattered across the artistic scenes, which identify individuals and describe parts of the story. Then there is a longer text, often called the bulletin, which provides a summary account of the battle as a whole. Finally, the lengthiest is the literary record, often known as the poem. This tells the same story as the bulletin, but in far more overblown and elaborate language. To tell this tale, I've intermixed all 3 of those sources. The translations are adapted and modified from Kenneth Kitchen's book series Ramesside Inscriptions, Volume 2. None of these Egyptian sources gives the full account on their own. They each include aspects and details which are absent in the other versions. For example, the arrival of the Narin, or reinforcement army. We get that from the art and a short caption or epigraph. But the bulletin and the poem do not mention those troops at all. Similarly, the artistic scenes themselves vary from temple to temple. The Abu Simbel version is quite different from that of the Ramesseum, and the Ramesseum is different from Luxor and Abydos. They all share the same broad strokes, but the smaller figures and details vary. So depending which source you are using, you get different pieces of the tale. Naturally, to get anything close to the full picture, you must integrate all of these, the art, the captions, and the extended records from every single temple at the same time. That is frustrating for scholars, not just because it multiplies the translation work, but also you have to wonder, how many other temples, now lost, had their own depictions of Kadesh? The monuments that survive are all in southern Egypt and Nubia, but Pharaoh also built temples in the north, at Memphis, Heliopolis, Ramesses, and so forth. Chances are those monuments had their own versions of Kadesh, each with their own bespoke details and texts. Even if the gist was the same, how many additional features have vanished? Alas, we might never know. Despite the elaborate hieroglyph narratives, the shorter captions, and the magnificent artistic compositions, there are still gaps in the story. And to be clear, it is a story. When Ramesses commissioned these works, he and his agents were not interested in a photographic, warts and all record. They had multiple goals: to glorify the king as a person, to set him up as the victorious hero who saved an entire army, and most crucially, to uphold the idea of the king as a concept, and to show his role as protector of the divine order, Ma'at. Ramesses' records of the Battle of Kadesh are really just a larger, more expanded version of things that his predecessors had done, from rulers like Seti I and Thutmose III, all the way back into the Middle and Old Kingdoms. The idea of the pharaoh as the lone warrior who destroys all foreign lands, that sits at the very center of their philosophical existence. We should always keep that in mind when we look at these images and tales. On the walls of a temple, a god's house, they serve a religious function in addition to the storytelling. What we have is a set of records shaped by royal and divine concerns. Finally, there is one more source for the battle. Remarkably, this one actually involves the Hittites a little bit. In the 1990s, a scholar named Edel published fragments of cuneiform letters that Ramesses had sent to Hatti about 20 years after Kadesh. They include a general description of the campaign, which agrees with most of the stuff that Ramesses says, maybe not the "I killed everyone single-handed," but the broad strategic and tactical events the movement of the armies, the confrontation near the city, the regrouping, the second clash, and then the withdrawal. These cuneiform reminiscences, as scholars call them, add extra details to the larger strategic tale. I will discuss those in a future episode. Next time, we're going to stay on the battlefield itself, for a mini-episode about ancient Egyptian medicine. Egyptian physicians were some of the finest in the ancient world, and their methods for dealing with injuries, especially wounds incurred in battle, were remarkably sophisticated and recognizable today. As the dust settles over the battlefield, I thought we should take a moment to consider the soldiers. That will be our next chapter. The History of Egypt podcast is supported by you, the listeners, and especially by my subscribers on Patreon. I would like to thank Martine, Patrick, Alison, Mark, and Barbara, who recently joined as nobles, and James, Jessica, Beth, Jerry, Catherine, and Estefan, who all joined as overseers on an annual membership. Folks, you are most generous. I am in your debt. Last, but certainly not least, I would like to thank the priests, the top-tier supporters who give most generously every month. My thanks to Linda, Eric, Nidin, Ashley, Terry, Cian, Dan, Chris, Daniel, TJ, Veronica, James, Yola, James B., Set Nacht, Mykost, Jeffrey, Suyon, Andy and Chelsea, Jean, Erjan, Karen, and Kate. Folks, you are all far too generous. I hope the great god Amun will appear in your chariot, or car, and keep you safe as you drive through a dangerous world. And when the storm gods, Sutek or Baal, thunder upon the horizon, I hope your allies stay loyal and true. Thanks for listening. I'll see you soon.